So the second theme is the identifying path towards interoperability of workflow systems, and it's going to be co-led by UK Altintes and from UC San Diego, and Stian Soiland Reis from the University of Manchester.
All right. So as Henri pointed out, there we know there are lots of workflow systems. I checked now latest, there's about almost 300 now on the list, and feel free to have a look and see if your favorites are there. I'm sure we will have a few more added by today. I'm not going to go through why they are different and so on, but we know they are different. And there's a little joke there in the end that they are not different in that none of them capture fair metadata, almost none of them at least. So what we want to discuss is a bit about why these differences occur, right? So why we know they're different for a reason, and it is because there's different execution models, as was pointed out by Dan there before, different expressivity in the languages that you have to use, and of course also the ecosystems that come along with the workflow systems. And when we talk about interoperability, we can talk about this on multiple levels. Now, in the previous meeting, we talked a lot about this kind of task level interoperability, scheduling tools, that kind of thing. But I want to point out this thing from the report about the European Open Science Cloud Interoperability Framework. Now, this is a more general framework, but it points out that interoperability goes at multiple levels. There's the technical level, of course, but there's also the semantic level. You need to agree what you're talking about, that things have the same meaning. And that also touches upon the things that Dan pointed out there because of what we actually imply behind the things we say. To have organizational meanings, so ecosystem communities, companies and so on, all these play a very important role in making interoperability actually happen. And I'll come back to that in the next slide. And then you have the legal issues, just having license compatibility, things like that. Are you allowed to share the data, that kind of level? So those are the kind of non-technical challenges that we face. And if we go back again to the technical, it's easy to think a lot about just the common representations that seems to be in need of this, but it's not as simple as that. We'll touch a bit about the level. So you can read more about this in the report, and this is a very, very incomplete list that we came up with within a few days. But if you see your favorites missing, again, just come here and we'll map out the little landscape for the different levels. If you think about the workflows involved with task execution, of course, there are different APIs and ways to do that. I put in some classics in there from the Open Grid forum, that for those of you remembering those. We should not forget about the lessons from before when we reinvent things. But you have a few, not very many, trying to do syntactic workflow interoperability, like the common workflow language. For doing semantics, we know the different kind of metadata standards and so on you can work with. Just describing the workflow on the outside in terms of inputs and outputs, maybe go a bit more into the purpose, like in the by computer object, or maybe even try to break down some of that workflow engine level execution logic into a kind of meta workflow where you might even be able to combine different workflow systems. Workflows also need to be moved around between the different systems to come along with the tools and the software that they need for execution. That's a very big challenge for interoperability. Very luckily now we have lots of things helping us, like Conda and Docker Singularity containers to package up the different tools that the workflow needs for running. And even some of the Linux distributions are trying to help out here. But to what extent are workflow themselves being packaged and moved around? And then, of course, we have data interoperability, which is a whole workshop in itself, which we cannot really go much into, but that is a very important part of the whole thing. To make two parts of the workflow talk to each other, of course, they need to understand the data. And there are various domain-specific and general efforts here. What I want to point out, because when I listed some of these, is that many of these kind of joint data standards, like HDF, which is a way of capturing data variables, or VO tables in astronomy, is that they basically turns into compound objects that then themselves can contain anything. So we see that quite a lot, this kind of nesting of data, which means you need a good way of describing that data using metadata, so both machines and humans can understand what is the purpose of the data. And then we have ways of sharing using repositories, which we touched upon in the last summit on communities and Workflow Hub. There are several other repositories that I mentioned here, like Dockstore, Galaxy Toolshed. Then you have the kind of hardware level interoperability, which for a long time now we're just taking for granted because everybody have pretty much the same machines. And then now it's diverging off again, right? We have all these different GPUs coming out. We have the new Macs coming with basically 3 different CPUs and so on. And then you have interoperability levels working there. And you see the same happening in the HPC landscape where you have this kind of hybrid hardware, we have multiple architectures. And that, of course, throws a span on the work for all the things we have tried above. Just some of the key findings. So we touched upon the interoperability issues, of course, about how we can compare between the systems and find patterns, which we heard coming up here. Funding is a key piece in here. And that, I think, comes back to the community and organizational experts. Because if you look back on that list we had before, many of those that actually work turns out to be because they have a strong community behind them. And there's a strong community because there's also sustained funding. So there are multiple people who get money to work together. They will actually try to work together. You can also work together on an ad hoc basis, as we're kind of doing here today, but it is harder to keep that sustained. Now, the fair computational workflow aspects, I don't want to throw them out, so we want to touch upon those as well, about how the workflow themselves can be interoperable units, maybe even between workflow systems. And we saw raised in the previous meeting also about the AI workflows. There was an example of this diversity in compute hardware, like different GPUs, makes it harder to do interoperability for AI workflows as well. Exascale, again, because you try to optimize workflows to be much more efficient, it usually means that you're hard coding lots of things, and then it makes it much harder to do interoperability, specific binaries of tools and so on. And as I mentioned, the community aspect is very important to not forget. So these are the kind of topics we hope to start off with, but we'll cover other things to come along. I want to hear about what happened when you didn't have interoperability. What could you not do, and how did you solve it? And we can kind of compare these kind of war stories just to get started quickly. And if we talk a bit more about what workflow system interoperability mean, or what do we actually mean to be included, and what do we not need to do? Because there are lots of things that are just nice to have that it's not right to do those. So that comes back into these layers that I mentioned. So where should we actually try to achieve interoperability? Maybe it's already achieved in some layers, and we say that's good enough. And then touch upon these bigger challenges on the semantic, organizational, and legal interoperability. What is the best way to try to foster those foundational basis for making sure the interoperability continue to work? And then you can bring in from your particular domain and systems, what existing efforts have you done? So we will more for the second session, where we list up things. So then you can add on to that big list I had before with the things that you know about from your community, and we can kind of compare notes and see what do they have in common. Yes, I welcome you, those of you interested in interoperability, to join this session. We started with requirements documents for interoperability layers, because we talked about how we cannot really talk about interoperability at different layers before we know what is it meant to do. So we think about the workflow system doing all those kind of things I mentioned in the lightning talk, the task execution, the data management, and so on. You have to think about each of them separately and see what is it, the commonality across the workflow systems that makes that part of being a workflow system. And once you have written that, then you can think about what is interoperability you need on there. And by thinking about these layers, you can have a separation of concern. And that can help you build different clusters of workflow systems, because they don't all do these things the same way. They don't have necessarily the same layers. But then we can address one of them and try to demonstrate interoperability fully in them. Maybe it's already been implemented and we can use that. Then number 2, we're talking about benchmarks. So we need kind of different kind of workflows that with fixed inputs, but in different kind of sizes. So you can test the same workflow in different system on different workflow systems. And having this is important to be real life workflows, not just simulated workflows. And when we're talking about use cases for interoperability, we need to see is there any point in this interoperability? We need to connect this to real actual problems by scientists existing. So we're starting up with talking about very real life cases, like people just building notebooks for doing the science, and then they struggle with moving between infrastructure. So that's the kind of real life scenario we're talking about. We're not talking about people who sit and want to run with 10 different execution backends, right? It is have to be realistic. So it comes down to kind of the needs for workflow system developers. We see that keep being developed workflow systems, but there's all these workflow papers out there saying all of these things have already been done, but they seem to not be reading them. So as a kind of minimal action, we're thinking about just gathering this in some kind of Zotero or something, gather them up. But again, we think it is too hidden away. So we need to kind of lift what we're building here with something like Workflow Array and build a workflow management system developer community. Maybe just a set of GitHub pages where you can find all these different things that may already exist or that you wish would exist, and that they can come together and find this information in an easier way. We talked a bit about having common APIs. Kind of, is it possible to build some kind of set of workflow library components that you can use to build your own workflow system? We know we don't like having all these workflow systems, but that seems to be happening anyway. So can we at least make some interoperable components in there that can be reused? And for instance, we touched upon, can that be representing the workflow itself, or should it deal with data conversion, for instance? That's a very common thing to be having to do, data conversion. And again, on usability, talking about different roles, because who is the interoperability for, right? Are we just helping the people doing workflow systems, or the people are designing, those who have to run them later? We talked a bit about funding being very important for building workflow interoperability, and this model of having one project that then hands out maybe small amounts to different projects, but that they can then help building into interoperability together under a larger project. So have that kind of model, which we have seen on the European side, has helped somewhat in getting a bit more practical purposes rather than always having novel things, having more useful things, and building tooling to help workflow developers and collecting data on what has already been done on workflows. So those are the kind of things we have been looking at. So we have basically 2 concrete action items you see down there, which we can do today, basically, right, to make the Zotero and make this some sub pages on the existing Workflow Array GitHub, for instance, right? Some simple wiki page or something. That's it.